3 weeks before Christmas, I came downstairs earlier than usual because I could not sleep and I wanted a glass of water. My son did not hear me on the stairs. He was in my kitchen on his phone and he was talking to someone about timelines. He was talking about the house. He was talking about what it would take to have a parent declared mentally unfit to manage their own affairs. He used the word incompetent. He used my name. And he said he wanted to move before the new year because the market was good right now and waiting was just losing money. I stood in the dark at the bottom of my own stairs and I listened to my son plan how to take everything I had spent my life building. And I made a decision before he finished the call. I was not going to say a word. Not yet. But by the time Christmas came, everything was going to be different. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something directly. What is the worst betrayal a person can experience? A stranger who cheats you? A friend who lies? Or a child you raised with your own hands who sat at your table and called you dad, quietly making phone calls in your kitchen about how to take your home while you sleep? Stay with John's story. Because what he did in the 3 weeks between that staircase and Christmas morning is one of the most careful and most satisfying things I have ever had the privilege of telling. Tell me in the comments, what would you have done if you had been standing on those stairs? My name is John, and I am going to tell you about the night I stood at the bottom of my own staircase in the dark and heard my son planning to have me declared incompetent so he could sell my house. I am going to tell you everything. I am going to tell you who I was before that night, and who my son was, and what our relationship had looked like from the outside, and what it had actually been on the inside for longer than I had admitted to myself. I am going to tell you what I did in the 3 weeks between that staircase and Christmas. And I am going to tell you what happened at the Christmas table when my son found out that the ground had shifted completely beneath him, while he thought I was just an old man who did not know what was happening around him. But first, I need you to understand something about me, because the kind of man I am is exactly why this story worked on me for as long as it did, and exactly why I was able to do what I did when I finally knew the truth. I am 69 years old. I spent 31 years working as a civil engineer for a county infrastructure department. I designed drainage systems and road foundations and flood management structures, which sounds unglamorous, but is the kind of work that requires you to think in long time frames, to understand how pressure builds slowly, and to know that the thing that looks stable on the surface is only as solid as what is underneath it. I retired at 62, and I have spent the years since then doing the things I always told myself I would do when I had time. I read, I garden, I maintain the house with the same attention I always gave it. I am not a man who sits still well, and I am not a man who misses details. My wife Margaret died 6 years ago. She had been ill for the last 2 years of her life, and I had cared for her through those 2 years with everything I had. And when she was gone, the house became quieter in a way that I have never fully gotten used to. But it is still home. It is the house we bought together 38 years ago. The garden has things I planted with my hands and things Margaret planted with hers. The kitchen has a shelf she built. The sitting room has the chair she always sat in, and I have not moved it. This house is not just property to me. It is the physical record of a life I built with someone I loved, and I intend to stay in it for as long as I am able, and I intend to leave it to the people I choose when I am ready to leave it. I have 2 children. My daughter Ruth, who is 41 and lives 3 hours away with her husband and 2 children, and who calls me every Sunday without fail and visits when she can. And my son Derek, who is 44 and lives 20 minutes from my house, and who has been, for the past 3 years, the child who is most present in my daily life. I want to be careful about how I describe Derek because I do not want to make him a cartoon. He is not a monster. He is a man who made choices I did not raise him to make, and who convinced himself those choices were reasonable, which is something that people are capable of when they want something badly enough, and when the person they want it from is old enough that they have started thinking of them in a different category than a full human being with full rights and full faculties. Derek had a difficult decade. He had gone through a divorce 5 years ago that had been expensive and painful. He had a business that had not done well and had been wound down 2 years before that night. On the staircase, he had debt that I knew about in general terms and did not know the specific shape of because Derek talked about his finances the way people talk about things they are ashamed of, in broad strokes that invited sympathy without inviting scrutiny. I had helped him financially twice in the 3 years since Margaret died. Once with a payment that I had described to myself as a loan, though we both knew it was not. Once with a smaller amount that he had asked for and I had given without enough thought. I want to be honest about why I had helped him, partly because he was my son and I loved him, partly because Margaret had loved him and helping him felt like something she would have wanted. And partly, I am ashamed to say, because Derek had a way of making me feel that refusing was a form of failure on my part, a failure of generosity or of fatherhood or of understanding what family meant. He had never said that directly. He was too careful for that. But the implication was always there in the particular quality of his silences after I said no to something, and in the way he described his situation in terms that required a certain kind of person to respond to. He had also started coming to the house more frequently in the year before that night, 2 or 3 times a week sometimes. He was attentive in a way I had told myself was love, and which I understand now was assessment. He would ask about the boiler and the roof and the windows. He would mention, casually, what houses on the street had sold for. He would say things about how a place like this needed someone active to maintain it properly, as though I were not the person who had been maintaining it properly for 38 years. He once said, with the gentleness of a man delivering difficult wisdom, that it might be worth thinking about the future while I still had choices, that a lot of people waited too long and ended up with no options. I had said I appreciated his concern. I had not said what I was thinking, which was that I was 68 years old and fully functional, and that the future he was describing as mine had not arrived yet and might not arrive for a very long time. I had not said it because I did not want a confrontation. I did not want to damage what I had told myself was a relationship that, whatever its complications, was still my son coming to see me, still my son at my table, still something. That generosity of interpretation was what I gave up on the night I stood at the bottom of the stairs. Let me take you back to that night. It was a Thursday. I had gone to bed at 10, which is my usual time, but I had woken at just after midnight with the dry throat I get sometimes in winter when the heating has been on too long. I got up quietly, out of habit, the habit of a man who had spent 2 years moving carefully through a house with a sleeping, sick wife. I came out onto the landing and I could see the light from the kitchen at the bottom of the stairs, which was unusual because I had turned it off before bed. I heard Derek's voice before I reached the first step down. He was not whispering. He was speaking in the low, even voice of a man having a professional conversation, and I caught the word solicitor in the first few seconds, which made me slow down rather than call out. I am an engineer. I notice when something is not where it should be. A solicitor conversation at midnight in my kitchen was not where it should be. I stood on the third step from the bottom and I listened. He was asking about process. He was asking how long it took. He was asking what evidence was needed. He used the phrase cognitive assessment. He used the phrase power of attorney challenge. He said his father was showing signs, and he listed things that I will not repeat here because they were fabrications presented as concern, and hearing them in my son's voice was the specific kind of pain that does not go away quickly. He said the house was the main asset, and that there were other family members who might complicate things if not handled correctly. He said he wanted to move before the new year. I stood on that step for the full length of the call. When he ended it, I went back upstairs. I did not get my glass of water. I sat on the edge of my bed in the dark, and I did what I have always done when I encounter a serious structural problem. I did not react to it immediately. I mapped it. I identified what I knew, what I did not know, what needed to happen first, and what the consequences of moving too fast would be versus moving too slowly. What I knew was that my son was consulting a solicitor about having me declared mentally incompetent. What I knew was that this was not a new idea, that a conversation that specific and that practical did not happen without prior thought and prior groundwork. What I knew was that the increased visits, the casual property valuations, the gentle suggestions about the future had not been concern. They had been prepara. Tian, what I did not know was how far along the process was, whether papers had already been filed somewhere, whether Derek had spoken to anyone else, including Ruth, about this, whether there was a second person involved who I had not yet identified. What I knew I needed to do first was call my own solicitor. Not tomorrow, first thing in the morning. I also knew that I needed Derek to have no idea that anything had changed. The value of what I had heard was entirely dependent on my being able to act on it before he knew I was acting. If he found out I had been on the stairs, he would accelerate. He would become more careful. He might file something before I had protected myself. The next 3 weeks required me to be exactly the same man Derek thought I was, slightly slow, a little forgetful in the normal ways of a man my age, grateful for his visits, asking about his life, making him tea. I could do that. I had spent 31 years thinking in long time frames. 3 weeks was nothing. I called my solicitor, a man named Bernard, at 9 the next morning. Bernard had handled my affairs since Margaret was alive, and he knew our family situation well. He was a careful man who did not alarm easily, and when I told him what I had heard from the staircase, he was quiet for a long moment before he spoke. He said, "John, I am glad you called me before doing anything else." He said the first thing I needed to understand was that a competency challenge of the kind Derek was describing was not something that happened quickly or easily. He said the bar for having a person declared mentally incompetent was high and required genuine medical evidence and a formal legal process, and that Derek's timeline of before the new year was almost certainly either optimistic or based on bad advice. He said this was good news in terms of how much time I had. He also said something that I needed to hear. He said the most powerful thing I could do right now was to formally document my own competence while it was not under challenge. He said a proactive cognitive assessment, commissioned by me and conducted by a qualified professional, was a document that would carry significant weight if Derek did attempt any formal process. He said the assessment would show a baseline of full function at a specific date, and that if Derek then attempted to claim I had been showing signs of decline, my own documented assessment would directly contradict his timeline. He said the second thing I needed to do was review my existing will and power of attorney documents and make sure they were current, clear, and correctly constructed. He said the third thing I needed to do was consider whether the current power of attorney, which named Derek as one of two attorneys alongside Ruth, needed to be revised. I had not thought about the power of attorney document in 2 years. Margaret and I had set it up together, and it had named both children as attorneys to act jointly. I had not revisited it since Margaret died. I had not thought about it because I had not imagined needing to think about it. I thought about it now. Bernard made the appointment with a clinical psychologist for the following Tuesday. A full cognitive assessment, standard battery of tests, memory, reasoning, executive function, processing speed. I drove myself to the appointment. I sat in a clean office, and I answered every question and completed every task with the full attention of a man who had spent 30 years solving structural problems. The psychologist, a woman named Dr. Pierce, told me at the end of the session that my results were well within the normal range for my age, and that she would have the formal report ready within 5 working days. I said thank you. I drove home. I made Derek's tea when he came over that evening, and I asked him how his week was going, and he said fine, and told me about a friend of his who had just bought a new car, and I listened and nodded and asked the right questions. He had no idea. The following day, I went back to Bernard's office, and we went through my will in full. The existing will was sound in its structure, but there were 2 things Bernard recommended updating. The first was a clarification of the specific conditions under which the house could be sold, which I had left somewhat open in the original document. Bernard recommended explicit language that the house was to remain in my possession for my lifetime unless I personally initiated a sale, and that no power of attorney holder had the authority to initiate a sale of the primary residence without my written consent while I retained capacity. We added that language. The second thing was the power of attorney. I want to be very clear about this decision because it was the hardest one I made in those 3 weeks, harder in some ways than any of the legal steps. Removing Derek from the power of attorney was not a small thing. It was a formal legal act that said, in plain terms, that I did not trust my to act in my interests if I were unable to act for myself. It was a document that acknowledged what I had heard on the stairs without me ever having to say it out loud. I asked Bernard to draw up a new power of attorney naming Ruth as sole attorney. He did. I signed it. It was witnessed and registered. I called Ruth that weekend. She came to see me on the Sunday, the same Sunday she always called, but in person this time. I told her what I had heard from the staircase. I told her about the solicitor, the assessment, the will changes, the power of attorney. I told her everything in the order it had happened. Ruth sat across from me at my kitchen table, the same table where Derek had been making his call, and she was very still while I talked. When I finished, she said, "Dad," and then she stopped. She tried again. She said, "I am so sorry." She said she had noticed things over the past year, things Derek had said about me in passing, comments about how I was managing, gentle suggestions in family conversations that perhaps things were getting difficult for me at the house. She said she had not understood what she was hearing until now. She said she had not known about the solicitor call. I believed her. I still believe her. I told her what I needed from her. I needed her to keep this conversation private until Christmas. I needed her to act normally with Derek in the meantime. I told her that Christmas was when I intended to have the conversation with Derek, not in anger and not as an ambush in the dramatic sense, but as a clear and documented accounting of what had happened and what I had done in response. Ruth asked me if I was sure I wanted to wait 3 weeks. I said yes. I said the 3 weeks were not for his benefit. They were for mine. I wanted everything to be in place. I wanted every document signed and registered. I wanted Dr. Pierce's report in my hand. I wanted to walk into that Christmas conversation with nothing left to do, nothing left to protect, everything already secured. I said when Derek walks into this house on Christmas Day, everything he was planning to take will already be beyond his reach. I said I want him to know that not because I want to hurt him, but because I want him to understand that the man he decided was incompetent was, in fact, the most organized man in the room. Ruth looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "That sounds like Dad," and she squeezed my hand. Derek came to the house twice more in those 3 weeks. Each visit was the same. He was attentive in his particular way. He asked about the boiler. He mentioned the gutters needed clearing. He said a house on the adjacent street had just gone for a very good price. I said that was interesting. I offered him tea. I asked about his life. I gave him nothing. On the second visit, about a week before Christmas, he mentioned for the first time that he had been speaking to someone about estate planning. He said it casually, as though it had just come up in conversation, as though it were merely something he had happened to think about. He said he thought it might be worth all of us having a conversation about it in the new year, just to make sure everything was clear and that everyone was protected. I said that sounded sensible. I said I had actually been doing some thinking about my affairs recently as well. I said perhaps Christmas was a good time to catch up on all of that as a family. He looked at me with the slightly too careful expression of a man trying to read a situation. I kept my face easy and open. I changed the subject. He left an hour later, and I watched his car pull out of the drive, and I went back inside, and I stood in my own kitchen, and I said out loud to no one in particular, 3 more days. Dr. Pierce's report arrived in the post on the 23rd of December. I opened it at my kitchen table. It was 8 pages long. It described my test results in full. On every measure, I was assessed as functioning well within normal range. On several measures, I was assessed above average for my age group. The conclusion was clear and unambiguous. There was no evidence of cognitive decline. There was no basis for any concern about my capacity to manage my own affairs. I read it twice. Then I put it in the folder I had been building over the 3 weeks. The folder contained the report, the signed new power of attorney, the updated will with the specific residential clause, Bernard's written summary of the changes and the dates on which each document had been signed and registered. and a one-page letter I had written myself to Derek, which I had not shown Bernard because it was not a legal document. It was just a letter, a father to his son. I will tell you what was in it later. Christmas Day. Derek arrived at 11 in the morning with a bottle of wine and a wrapped gift and the easy manner of a man who is managing something without letting it show. Ruth arrived at the same time which I had arranged, and her husband, her two children came with her, and the house was full of the particular noise of a Christmas that had children in it, which was something I had missed. We ate at 2. The food was good. The children were chaotic in the cheerful way. Derek was relaxed in a way that I read as the relaxation of a man who believed his plan was on track and who was enjoying the last comfortable Christmas before things became complicated. He was warm with me. He refilled my glass. He told a story at the table that made everyone laugh. After the meal, when the children had gone to the sitting room and Ruth's husband was clearing the table, I said I had something I wanted to share with the family. Derek looked up. His expression was the slightly alert look of a man who was monitoring for things that might be relevant to his interests. I put the folder on the table. I did not make a speech. I am not a man who makes speeches. I am a man who presents information and lets it speak. I said I had spent the past few weeks putting my affairs in proper order and that I wanted the family to be aware of what I had done. I said I had commissioned a formal cognitive assessment, which was in the folder, and that the results were clear. I said I had updated my will to include specific language about the house and the conditions under which it could and could not be sold or transferred. I said I had revised my power of attorney, which was also in the folder, and that the revised document named Ruth as sole attorney. I said all of this in the calm voice of a man presenting engineering documentation, just facts, just structure, just what was underneath the surface, now visible. Derek's face did the thing I had been waiting 3 weeks to see. Not an explosion, something quieter and more specific than an explosion. A rearrangement. The case he had been building in his head, the timeline, the market being good right now, the before the new year, all of it was meeting a reality it had not accounted for. And I watched him process that in real time, and I felt not satisfaction exactly, but the particular feeling of a man who has done the work correctly and is watching the structure hold. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "What is this about?" I said, "I think you know what it is about, Derek." I said, "I heard you on the phone on the Thursday 3 weeks ago." I said, "I heard the whole call." The table was very quiet. He started to say something. He stopped. He tried again. He said he had just been asking questions, that he had been worried about me, that he had not meant anything by it, that he had not actually filed anything or done anything, that he had just been exploring. I said, "I know." I said that was why I had 3 weeks. I slid the letter across the table to him. The letter said the following. It said I was his father, and I loved him, and that would not change. It said I was also a man who had heard his son describe him as incompetent on a phone call to a solicitor, and that what I had felt standing on those stairs was something I would carry for a long time. It said I was not going to pretend the conversation had not happened. It said I was also not going to make it the end of everything, but that what it was going to be was the end of any conversation about my house, my affairs, my capacity, or my future that did not come from me first. It said the documents in the folder were in place and were not going to change. It said I hoped we could find a way to be father and son again that did not require me to be smaller than I was. It was 1 page. I had written it 3 times before I was satisfied with it. Derek read it slowly. Ruth watched him read it. Her husband had come back to the table and was standing very still. The children were laughing about something in the other room. When Derek finished reading, he put the letter down. He looked at the table. He did not look at me for a long moment, and when he did, his eyes were the eyes of a man who has been fully seen for the first time in a conversation where he expected to be doing the seeing. It was not a comfortable look, but it was an honest one. He said he was sorry. I said I know. He said he had gotten into a bad place financially and he had started thinking about things he should not have been thinking about. He said he had not been thinking about me as his father when he made that call. He said he did not know how to explain that except to say that he had gotten lost somewhere and that he was ashamed. I said I know that too. I said we were not going to fix everything today. I said today was Christmas and the children were in the other room and we were going to sit at this table and have dessert and I was going to make coffee and we were going to be a family for the rest of this afternoon. I said the other conversation, the real one, was going to happen, but not today. He nodded. Ruth reached across the table and put her hand over mine and did not say anything. She did not need to. I want to tell you what happened after Christmas because the after is where the real shape of things became clear. Derek and I had several conversations over the following months. Hard conversations. Honest ones. He told me the full extent of his financial situation, which was worse than I had known, not because he had been hiding the worst of it from me, but because he had been hiding the worst of it from himself, and reality and shame had finally been in the same room long enough that the walls came down. I did not rescue him. I want to be clear about that. I did not write a check and make the problem disappear and return everything to the comfortable arrangement where his difficulty was something I absorbed, and he managed through generosity that had no bottom. I had learned what that produced. What I did was help him find a debt advisor through a legitimate service, and I told him I would support the process emotionally, but that the financial reconstruction was his to do. He did it. It took 14 months, and it was not easy, and there were several calls during those months where I could hear how hard it was. But he did it. The relationship between Derek and me now is different from what it was before the staircase. It is more honest, which makes it sometimes more uncomfortable, but discomfort that is honest is a different thing entirely from comfort that is performed. He comes to the house still. He helps with the gutters genuinely now without the assessment quality to it. He does not mention the house price. He asks about my garden. He told me once about 8 months after Christmas that he was sorry in a way that was more specific than the Christmas apology, more considered, and I believed it in a way I had not fully believed the first one. I told him I accepted it. I told him that what I needed from him was not an apology that was repeated but a change that was sustained. He said he understood. So far, he has sustained it. Ruth and I have always been close, but we are closer now. She knows things about me that she did not know before, not because I was hiding them, but because I had never had reason to share them. She knows how I think under pressure. She knows that I am more patient than I look. She knows that her father, at 69, on a cold December staircase in the dark, made a decision to protect himself with the same methodical attention he had given to every serious problem of his professional life, and that it worked completely. She told me once that she was proud of me. I said I was just doing what engineers do. She said, "What is that?" I said we look at what is underneath before we decide whether the surface can hold. The house is still mine. The garden is still Margaret's and mine together. The shelf she built is still in the kitchen, and I still use it every day. I am 69 years old, and I am fully capable of managing my own affairs, and I have an 8-page clinical report and a revised legal document and a folder of evidence that proves it, all of which I hope I never need to use again, but which will be there if I do. I want to say something to anyone who is older and who is watching this, and who has felt the particular unease of wondering whether the people around you are seeing you clearly or seeing what they want to see in you. Whether the attention you are receiving is love or inventory. Whether the concern being expressed is for you or for what you represent. You are allowed to notice that feeling. You are allowed to take it seriously. You are allowed to act on it without waiting for someone to give you permission or to tell you that you are not being paranoid. You built what you built. You earned what you have. You have the right to decide what happens to it and when and to whom. Nobody gets to make that decision for you before you are ready, and certainly not while you are standing right there, fully present and fully capable in your own home. I was on those stairs. I heard every word. And I spent 3 weeks making sure that what my son was planning would find nothing left to land on. That is what John did. And John is still in his house, still in his garden, still in the chair across from Margaret's chair, still here. John did not confront his son in the dark on those stairs. He did not cry or rage or collapse. He went back to bed, mapped the problem the way an engineer maps a structural fault, and spent 3 weeks building something his son could not touch. If this story hits something real in you, I want to hear from you in the comments. If you have ever felt the specific chill of wondering whether someone close to you was counting what you had instead of caring about who you are, tell me how you handled it. And if you are older and watching this and recognizing something in John's story, I want you to know that what he did is available to you too. The documents exist. The assessments exist. The solicitors exist. You are allowed to protect yourself quietly, thoroughly, and completely. The people who counted on your trust before you knew what they were doing did not count on you being this clear. Tell me in the comments, what was the moment in this story that hit you hardest?